The fire marshal stood in my driveway at 7:15 in the morning, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression I'd seen before in my years as an ER nurse. The look people use when they're about to deliver news that will split your life into before and after. He said my name. I nodded. He said there'd been a fire at the apartment complex where my son lived. He said they'd found a body in Unit 4B. He said the remains matched my son's height and build. He said dental records would be needed for final identification, but given the circumstances and the fact that no one else was reported missing from the building, they were confident it was him. I asked what time the fire started. He said 2:47 a.m. I asked if anyone else was hurt. He said no, just the one fatality. I asked if they knew the cause. He said they were still investigating, but it appeared to have started in the kitchen. I stood there in my bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and listened to him explain the next steps. Identification, remains release paperwork. I nodded at appropriate intervals. I signed something. He left his card. When he drove away, I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I just sat there, trying to understand that my 26-year-old son was gone. His name was Ethan. Ethan Crawford. I'd raised him alone after his father left when he was 3. It had been just the two of us for 23 years. He'd been a quiet kid, smart, careful. He'd studied computer science, worked remotely for a tech company, kept to himself. We talked twice a week. He'd called me 4 days ago to tell me about a project he was working on. Now he was gone. The dental records confirmed it 3 days later. The medical examiner called and said the identification was positive. Ethan Michael Crawford, deceased. Cause of death, smoke inhalation. The body would be released to the funeral home I'd selected. I arranged everything methodically. A small service, cremation. I chose an urn. I wrote an obituary. I notified his employer, his landlord, his few friends. I answered condolences with thank yous. I moved through it all like I was underwater. The service was on a Thursday. 17 people came. I stood beside the urn and accepted their sympathy. Ethan's supervisor from work said he'd been a brilliant programmer. A former college roommate said he'd been a good friend. No one knew what to say, so they said the things people say. Afterward, I took the urn home and placed it on the mantel. Then I sat on the couch and stared at it until it got dark. I was 53 years old. I'd worked night shifts in the ER for 28 years. I lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, mortgage paid off, no pets, no hobbies beyond gardening and reading. Ethan had been the center of my life, not in a smothering way. He'd had his independence, his own space, but he'd been my purpose. The reason I kept going after his father left, the reason I worked the brutal shifts, saved money, built stability. And now he was ashes in a ceramic urn. I took 2 weeks off work. I didn't leave the house much. I went through Ethan's things, the boxes I'd kept from his childhood, his college textbooks, photos. I found his old journals, his high school yearbooks, cards he'd made me for Mother's Day when he was little. I also started going through the paperwork from the fire marshal and the medical examiner. I don't know why. Maybe it was the nurse in me, trained to check details, verify information, make sure nothing was missed. The fire report listed the cause as accidental. A stove burner left on, igniting a dish towel. The apartment had no working smoke detector. The landlord was cited for code violations. The body had been found in the bedroom, not the kitchen. The report said the victim had likely been asleep when the smoke overcame him. It made sense. Ethan had always been a heavy sleeper. But something about it felt off. I requested a copy of the autopsy report. It arrived 2 weeks later. It was technical, clinical, exactly the kind of document I'd read hundreds of times in my career. Cause of death: acute carbon monoxide poisoning and smoke inhalation. No signs of trauma. Toxicology clean except for trace amounts of alcohol, likely from a beer or two earlier in the evening. I read it 3 times. Then I noticed something. The report noted a healed fracture in the left radius, consistent with an injury sustained years prior. Ethan had broken his right wrist when he was 12, falling off his bike. Not his left, his right. I pulled out the X-rays from that injury. I'd kept them in a folder with his medical records. Right wrist. Confirmed. I called the medical examiner's office. I spoke to a clerk named Brenda. I explained the discrepancy. She said she'd look into it and call me back. She called me back 3 days later. She said the medical examiner, Dr. Patel, had reviewed the file. She said the fracture notation was accurate according to the X-rays taken during the autopsy. She said it was possible I was misremembering which wrist Ethan had broken. I said I wasn't misremembering. I said I was a nurse. I said I had the records. She said she'd pass my concerns along. I didn't hear back. I started looking into other details. I requested Ethan's dental records from his dentist and compared them to the ones used for identification. I'm not a forensic expert, but I'd worked with enough dental charts in the ER to know how to read them. The records didn't match. Small differences, fillings in different positions, a root canal that Ethan had never had. I called the medical examiner's office again. This time I asked to speak to Dr. Patel directly. I was transferred twice and left a voicemail. He didn't call back. I called the fire marshal. I asked if they'd done a thorough search of the apartment after the fire. He said they had. I asked if they'd found Ethan's phone, his laptop, his wallet. He said personal effects had been logged and could be claimed. I went to the station and picked up the box. Inside was a melted phone, a warped wallet with a driver's license, and a set of keys. No laptop. Ethan never went anywhere without his laptop. I asked where it was. The officer checking me out said it must have been destroyed in the fire. I said Ethan worked from home. He would have had it in the apartment. The officer shrugged and said sometimes things don't survive. I took the box home and looked at the driver's license. The photo was Ethan. The name was Ethan, but the height listed was 6 feet. Ethan was 5'10". I'd watched him get measured at his last physical. I called Dr. Patel's office again. I said I needed to speak to him about inconsistencies in the autopsy. The clerk said he was unavailable. I said I'd wait. She said he'd call me when he had time. He didn't call. I went to the apartment complex where Ethan had lived. The building had been partially condemned after the fire. Unit 4B was gutted. I stood outside and looked at the charred windows. A neighbor came out and asked if I was family. I said I was Ethan's mother. She said she was sorry for my loss. She said she'd seen the fire trucks that night. She said it had been terrifying. I asked if she'd known Ethan. She said not well, but she'd seen him around. I asked if she'd seen him the night of the fire. She said no. She said she hadn't seen him in a few days actually. Maybe a week. I asked if anyone else lived in 4B with him. She said not that she knew of. But she said there'd been someone visiting a lot recently. A man, maybe in his 30s, coming and going at odd hours. I asked what he looked like. She said tall, thin, dark hair. She said she'd thought maybe it was a friend or a roommate. I thanked her and left. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Karen Ellis. I met her at her office and explained everything, the inconsistencies in the autopsy, the mismatched dental records, the wrong fracture, the missing laptop, the height discrepancy, the neighbor's statement about a visitor. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You think the body they found wasn't your son?" I said, "I think something's wrong." She said, "This is going to be expensive, and it might not lead anywhere." I said, "I don't care." She said, "Okay." Karen started digging. She requested copies of the fire report, the autopsy, the identification records. She interviewed the neighbor. She checked Ethan's financial records, bank statements, credit cards. She found something. Ethan's credit card had been used 3 times after the fire, once at a gas station 200 miles away, once at a grocery store, once at a motel. Karen said, "Either someone stole his card, or your son's alive." I said, "Find out." She traced the transactions. The gas station had security footage. She requested it. The footage showed a man in a baseball cap using the card at the pump. The angle was bad, but the build looked right. The height looked right. Karen said, "I can't confirm it's him from this. But it's not nothing." She kept digging. She found the motel where the card had been used. She called and asked if they had records of a guest matching Ethan's description. They did. He'd checked in under a different name, Paul Hendricks. He'd stayed 2 nights, then checked out. Karen said, "I think your son faked his death." I said, "Why would he do that?" She said, "I don't know. But I'm going to find him." It took her 3 weeks. She traced him to a town in Montana. She found an apartment rented under the name Paul Hendricks. She confirmed he was living there. She sent me a photo. It was Ethan, older, thinner, with a beard. But it was him. Karen said, "Do you want me to approach him?" I said, "No, I'll do it." I flew to Montana the next day. Karen gave me the address. I drove there in a rental car and parked across the street. I waited. At 4 in the afternoon, Ethan came out. He was wearing jeans and a jacket, carrying a bag of groceries. He looked tired. He looked like someone who'd been running. I got out of the car and walked across the street. He didn't see me at first. Then he looked up. His face went white. I said, "We need to talk." We went to a diner 2 blocks away. We sat in a booth in the back. He ordered coffee. I ordered nothing. He wouldn't look at me. I said, "Whose body did they find?" He didn't answer. I said, "Ethan." He said, "A guy I knew. He was crashing at my place. He didn't have anywhere else to go. He was using drugs. I tried to help him. Then one night I came home and found him passed out on the couch with a lit cigarette. The place was on fire. I got him out, but he was already gone. I panicked. I said, "So you made it look like it was you?" He said, "I switched our IDs. I moved him into my bed. I left. I thought if people thought I was dead, I could disappear." I said, "Why would you want to disappear?" He said, "Because I owed money, a lot of money, to people who don't forget." I said, "What people?" He said, "Gambling. Online poker. I got in deep. I couldn't pay. They threatened me. They said they'd hurt you if I didn't pay. So I ran." I said, "And you let me bury someone else." He said, "I didn't know what else to do." I said, "You let me grieve you." He said, "I know." I said, "Who was he? The man who died?" He said, "His name was Aaron. He was homeless. He didn't have family. I don't think anyone was looking for him." I said, "Someone should have been." We sat in silence. Then I said, "You're coming back." He said, "I can't." I said, "You're coming back, and you're fixing this. You're going to the police, you're going to tell them what happened, and you're going to face the consequences." He said, "They'll arrest me." I said, "Yes." He said, "I could go to prison." I said, "You deserve to?" He said, "Mom," I said, "you let me think you were dead. You let me cremate someone I didn't know and put him on my mantel. You let me mourn for a month while you were hiding in Montana. I don't care what you owe or who you're scared of. You're going to do the right thing." He looked at me, then he nodded. We flew back together. I contacted a lawyer, a criminal defense attorney named Mark Reeves. I explained the situation. He said it was complicated. He said Ethan would be charged with fraud, possibly obstruction, possibly desecration of remains. He said the best we could hope for was a plea deal. Ethan turned himself in. He gave a full statement. He identified Aaron, a man named Aaron Kemp, last known to be living on the streets of Portland. The authorities located Aaron's family. They hadn't seen him in 5 years. They'd assumed he was dead. Ethan pled guilty to multiple charges. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with credit for time served and the possibility of parole after 18 months. I didn't visit him. I buried Aaron properly. I had his name added to a grave marker. His sister came to the small service I arranged. She thanked me. She said it meant a lot to finally have closure. I kept the urn with Ethan's name on it. I didn't throw it away. I didn't display it. I just put it in a box in the garage. Ethan called me once from prison. He said he was sorry. I said I knew. He asked if I'd forgiven him. I said I didn't know yet. He's been out for 8 months now. He lives in a halfway house. He works at a warehouse. He calls me once a week. I answer. We talk about small things. We don't talk about what happened. I don't know if I'll ever forgive him. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word for what I feel, but he's alive. And maybe that's enough for now. If you've ever stayed silent long enough to find the truth hidden beneath what everyone believed, you're not alone.